So the purpose of this video is to take a look at energy and where it comes from and how it moves, and define producers and some different types of consumers. Our goals will be to describe how energy flows through an ecosystem and then define key terms. So whenever we talk about energy, we're talking about the interaction between organisms and the environment and how they rely upon the need for energy. And we looked at this with photosynthesis and cellular respiration. How do organisms use sunlight to make usable energy? And then how do other organisms take that and make that into something useful for themselves by making ATP through cellular respiration? So energy has to be transferred from one organism to another. Energy will flow in one direction, meaning that it'll come originally from the sun, it'll go to producers, and then to consumers. All organisms are going to need energy for growth, for reproduction, for metabolic processes, and so they have to get some energy from somewhere. Ultimately, the source of energy, like I said, is from the sun, but we need organisms that can take that sunlight energy and convert it into glucose and something useful. So we talk about primary producers, specifically autotrophs, that are going to use solar energy through photosynthesis to produce food, and they'll be assembling inorganic compounds into complex organic molecules, like we talked about carbohydrates. Autotrophs are going to basically feed themselves, and they store energy then for other organisms. So we're thinking about things like plants, algae, bacteria that are going to be able to capture the energy from the sun. Just keep in mind that autotrophs are also primary producers. Primary producers are going to be the first producers of energy-rich compounds that can be used by other organisms. They are essential as the starting point for energy flow through the biosphere, so primary producers are always going to be the starting point for our food chains. Just as a reminder, we talk about capturing energy from the sun, and autotrophs are going to capture that mostly through photosynthesis. That's the capturing of light energy and converting carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and then carbohydrates like glucose. Some organisms will go through a process called chemosynthesis, which is using chemical energy from inorganic molecules that don't contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen bonds. So these type of producers would be found in the deep parts of the ocean where no sunlight can reach, or in other harsh type of environments where you're not going to have the traditional photosynthesis taking place. And these types of producers would likely be bacteria, maybe some algae, or some really specially modified plants. So if we look at consumers, these are going to also be different types of heterotrophs that are going to acquire energy from other organisms. And so they rely on other organisms for energy and for their nutrients. We can classify consumers by the way that they acquire their energy and nutrients, but even within the categories, there are differences in how the energy is processed. So some organisms may be kind of in different categories. So they might be carnivores, meaning that they eat meat, but they might also scavenge for their food as well. So some of these categories, organisms can fit into multiple ones. So different types of consumers. We have carnivores. They are going to obtain energy by killing and eating other animals, so like a bear or a lion. You have herbivores, which will obtain energy by eating plant leaves, roots, seeds, nuts, fruits. You're going to have herbivores giraffes or elephants are going to be herbivores. We have omnivores, and these organisms will have diets that consist of both plants and animals, so that would be like humans, if they're not vegetarians, but anything that's going to eat both plants and animals will be an omnivore. Scavengers will consume carcasses of other animals that have been killed by predators or other causes, and so they're not hunting, they're just kind of finding the leftovers. Other types of consumers are decomposers. These are going to be organisms that get nutrients by consuming dead and decaying organic material. And this is going to be very important because it allows nutrients to be accessible then to other organisms. So it kind of releases those nutrients and puts them back into the system. Whenever we look at nutrients, they really cycle through, and so decomposers and detritivores are very important for getting those nutrients out of the dead organisms and then into materials that then can be used and cycled back through. Decomposers are going to produce what's called detritus, which is going to be small pieces of dead and decaying plant and animal remains. Decomposers can be things like bacteria and fungi. Detritivores are going to feed on detritus, so they're going to feed on dead and decaying plant and animal remains that have been decomposed a little bit, and they're going to then put those into smaller particles. So things like earthworms, snails, shrimp, crabs are very important for recycling these nutrients and putting then those nutrients back into the soil that can then be used by autotrophs and producers like plants. So detritivores will commonly digest decomposers that live on and in the detritus particles and then also recycle those decomposers.